glass of wine over this.
I'm drinking a rum and coke. You do whatever
Nice.
whatever feels good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Shannon Q. I am Shannon Q, and I am very, very excited to have this conversation today. This is somebody I'm a massive, massive fan of. We've shared some interlocutors, and somebody that I've been following for quite some time who I'm very excited to pick his brain about the Kalam. So, before we get started, I just want you to have the opportunity, Alex, to introduce yourself to everybody. Tell everybody who you are, what your background is, and where to find you should they want to look.
So I'm Alex Malpass. I guess you can find some stuff I've been doing. I have a YouTube channel. I'm not very good at promoting stuff, so
That's okay.
you can put a link in the description or whatever. If you want to look at that, you can. Um, is that enough? Can I just say that?
Yeah, you can just say that. You don't have to say much
Okay,
more than that, Alex. It's okay. I don't
that's
know if
good.
you on
Let's
this
just
one.
do that.
That's
Yeah,
perfectly fine. So the reason that I
I like
invited,
talking about philosophy more than myself.
well,
That's
then we'll get right to it. That's what
good.
that's what we're here to do. So we'll
Yeah.
get right to it. We don't need to waste any time. So I threw a bunch of different topics by you, and then I realized that there's something that you kind of specialize in that I would be remiss if I didn't pick your brain about the first opportunity that I had, because it's something that I encounter. I host call-in shows. I'm kind of a public atheist, so I encounter the kalam quite often and want to make sure that my interaction with it is as robust as possible and that I have the best understanding of it possible and help my audience maybe do that as well. So you'd be the perfect person to have these dialogues with. And I just read a paper that you sent me. You sent me two. Unfortunately, I was only able to read the first of the two, but I already have 1,000 questions about that. So it'll
Mhm.
take up maybe an infinite amount of time on this stream today. So before we get into it, I think the first thing that I might be a good starting point for us is to say what the kalam is. So do you want to give a brief sort of summation of what the kalam argument is and specifically which one we'll be engaging, because I've also encountered that's not the version that I'm talking about. Which one will we be engaging?
Okay, so the way that I think about it, so the Kalam is a type of, so it's an argument for the existence of God, right? It's one of the kind of traditional arguments that people give to try and prove that God exists.
Mm-hmm.
It's a cosmological argument, which basically means that it's to do with notions of causation. So it's supposed to be reasoning from um, things about, yeah, the notion of causation, the existence of the universe, to the existence of God. And what makes it different to kind of other versions of cosmological arguments, like, so for people might know these kind of Leibnizian versions of the cosmological argument, which is saying something like, everything needs an explanation, and God's the explanation of everything. Some very, very you know simplistic way of looking at it would be something like that, where it's about the notion of explanation. What this is about is it's about the universe having a beginning in time in the past, and that beginning in time, in particular, is what shows you that God exists. So the Kalam cosmological argument is characterized by this focus on the beginning of the universe in time at some specific point in the past. So it's all about the finitude of the past. So the basic fundamental thing that the Kalam is trying to establish is that the past wasn't infinitely old, right? That there was a beginning at some point, which obviously fits quite nicely with kind of creation myths from various types of religion, where they say, some, not really at some point in time there was nothing, but God makes everything, and that's the origin of all of the stuff that's here. It's a physical point in time where everything comes into being. Um, and it's got a history where, I mean, the traditional kind of pagan view is that the universe is eternal. So it's just like Aristotle's view is that the universe is infinitely old in the past and will continue to exist forever. So it has no temporal boundary. And then there's a kind of subtle sea change in intellectual history, which actually predates so the Kalam has its origin in kind of Arabic or Islamic philosophy, where the word Kalam comes from, but actually you can see it in certain writers that predate the Islamic tradition completely. A guy called Philoponus. Anyway, we don't need to go into the detail of the history, but there was, there's some point where everybody thought the universe was eternal to the past, and then philosophical thinking changed, and the religious philosophical tradition built up this kind of battery of arguments to show that the universe came into existence at some point in the past. And then not all religious thinkers have accepted that. Whilst they accept that the universe came into existence at some point in the past, not all of them agreed that you can see this through the light of reason, right? So Aquinas, Aquinas famously said that you can only know the universe came into existence at some point in the past through revelation. Right? We know it because it's in the Bible, but that effectively reason can't tell you on its own, unguided by revelation, whether the universe began to exist or not. So he knew it, but he didn't know it because of an argument, philosophical argument. So, and these days people, it's famously was given this strong defense in the late 70s by William Lane Craig, and this is who's synonymous almost with the argument these days. It's kind of Craig and the tradition of Craigian philosophers these days that follow in that in that mold nowadays. Definitely do disagree with Aquinas on that one and say, it's not just through, I mean, you do know through revelation because it says so in the Bible, but actually these philosophical and indeed scientific arguments these days, they think provides enough to make you think that you can know it for these independent means too, that the universe came into existence. And so I suppose that stage one of the Kalam, the kind of basic version of it, is just the premise. It says everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Premise one. Premise two, the universe began to exist. So then the conclusion follows that the universe had a cause for its existence. And that's it, right? It's just doesn't necessarily mean that the cause is God. And then you kind of have this supplementary sort of stage two stuff where it's saying, okay, now we know that there's a cause for the universe, right? Now we know that it began to exist at some point in time and it had a cause. Then we can say stuff like, what was that cause like? And then they think they can deduce, well, it must have been really, really powerful and it couldn't have existed in space and time and blah, blah, blah. And you seem to get the God, a kind of God of classical theism, atemporal, omnipotent mind or whatever that could make something come into existence from nothing. And so that's the kind of stage two aspect of it. So step one is just really trying to put the core kind of Kalam is just those two premises and the conclusion. Everything that begins to exist has a cause and the universe began to exist. So the universe has a cause. That's the Kalam really. And stage two comes after that, bolting on, and that cause must be God, basically. Okay. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, no, that was an excellent summation. So that sums up my understanding. And previously, I've interacted with it ignoring stage two. So I've essentially said, even if I accept all of your premises and the conclusion, all that gets me to is sufficient cause. And that's kind of been enough for me in the past. But after reading your paper, and you were addressing, you and Morriston, is it Dr. Morriston that you wrote the paper with? I'm very interested in how you interact with premise two, because it seems to be that it's potentially refuted by the idea of infinities being plausible. Like, so there could be an infinite past the same way that there could be an infinite future. And if that is the case logically, then you don't have a lot of support for premise two. So I was hoping that you might explain how you interacted with that premise a little bit, and then I can go into how I helped myself understand it in the hopes that I could maybe run that by you, and that's going to involve me doing my reformulation of Hilbert's Hotel, which it's the first I'd heard of Hilbert's Hotel, actually, because I'm not philosophically adept, but I thought it was really, really interesting, and I kind of reformulated Hilbert's Hotel in order to help me better understand your argument surrounding premise two. So would you mind kind of giving a succinct sort of summation of that? Because I'm really interested to ask you some questions about it.
Okay, so premise two, which is the premise that the universe began to exist, is typically given in these apologetic contexts two types of defenses. So we can call those scientific and philosophical. So the scientific justifications for that premise are things from cosmology, right? About like the Big Bang and, you know, the redshift of the galaxies and the background microwave radiation, stuff like this, that leads cosmologists to think that 13.8 billion years ago or whatever, everything was in a very small, compact, dense, very hot state, right? Like the theme tune in the Big Bang Theory that starts off saying that, right? So now, does that mean that the universe began then, or is that just that everything was really compact and hot at that point? It's not quite clear. And I think these days, the kind of field of cosmology or cosmogony, which is the beginning of the universe, there's quite a lot of disagreement there, and people have lots of different models, and really no one really knows, right? It's just it's a very fast moving speculative field of science, which is not settled, and there's not a big consensus. It's certainly not a consensus that at that point everything began out of nothing or something like that. It's not clear. So despite what apologists might tell you and what maybe scientists were thinking some time ago in the sort of 70s and 80s, I think these days people are a lot more cautious what to say about that. So to me, the scientific evidence is uninteresting for that reason. You're just wandering into a field where no one really knows what to say about that. So it's hardly helpful from building an argument, and there's not much to have to refute, it seems to me. If you're minded to refute it. The philosophical arguments, on the other hand, is what I'm interested in. Obviously, I'm a philosopher by training, or not a scientist, so I'm into the philosophical arguments. So when we come to those, Craig normally gives two types of arguments for it, but these days you also find a couple of other variants as well as the field is developing. So, I mean, I think it's fair enough to add in, so for instance, a Grim Reaper argument as another way of presenting a philosophical argument for the same premise too. And there's a couple of other peripheral ones kicking about in the literature as well. But the two main ones is Hilbert's Hotel argument and the successive addition argument. And the paper that I sent you, there's one on each of Craig's arguments effectively. So the one that you read, I guess we'll talk more about, which is focusing on Hilbert's Hotel argument.
Yeah.
So that argument says that it basically says if the past was infinitely long, if there was no beginning to the past, then it would have this problematic property. And the property it would have, it would be one that's shared by infinite sets of things. So I guess a little sort of thumbnail sketch of sort of mathematics of infinity was changed quite drastically in the 19th century by a kind of pioneering mathematician called Georg Cantor, who was actually ended his life in an insane asylum and struggled a lot with the reception of his ideas in the mathematical community. But he kind of provided this mathematics of the infinite and formalized and put together some basic ideas that were kind of appearing, sort of people kind of grasping little bits of the outside of it, but really the kind of full mathematical treatment of the infinite didn't really exist until then. So Galileo has an inkling of this sort of 200 years prior to that, with a little idea that he has of how you can show that there's just as many like natural numbers. So by natural number, I mean like counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, blah, blah. There's just as many natural numbers as there are even numbers. And you can show this by lining up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 up here, and then underneath them, directly underneath the 1, you write 2, directly underneath the 2, you write 4, blah, blah, blah. So you can, in a one-to-one sense, map all of the natural numbers with just the even numbers. And the thing is, you're never going to run out of either of them, right? There's going to be just as many even numbers as there are natural numbers, because you could consistently pair them one-to-one. And that effectively, that mechanism of being able to pair all of the elements of one set with all of the elements of another is just what we mean by there being the same amount in each set. So for instance, take my cutlery drawer, right? There's just as many forks as there are knives in there. And what that means is if I was to take them all out and lie them out on the table, I could have loads of forks up here, and then underneath each fork, I put a knife down. And that just means there's one knife for each fork, and there's no remainder left over in either set. That's just what it means to say that there's the same number of knives as there are forks. And what we're doing here is we're saying we can do the same thing with the natural numbers and just the even numbers. So it has this counterintuitive result, because you think, hold on a minute, there has to be half as many even numbers as natural numbers, right? Where are all the odd numbers, right? So there has to be half as many, but also there's the same amount. So this is where the problematic property kind of reveals itself, because ordinarily the whole is greater than any of its parts, right? And I think it's like a proper part of a whole, like one slice of a cake is less than the whole cake. But here you can sort of make a slice of the cake which actually is the same volume as the whole cake. And that's what an infinite property is like.
And intuitively, that doesn't make sense to most people.
Yeah, right. So intuitively, it doesn't make sense. That's true. And what Cantor does is show mathematically how you can model this so that it's like coherent. It doesn't just dissolve.
So how does Hilbert's hotel factor into, like, I want to get into that. I don't mean to rush you
Sure.
along.
No. Do rush me along, because I tend to waffle.
I'm very interested in the Hilbert's hotel. And my understanding of Hilbert's hotel is you have a hotel, and there's infinite amount of rooms with an infinite amount of people in the rooms. And it shows the absurdity of potential infinites, because if a new guest shows up and you move guest in room 1 to room 2 and so on and so forth all the way up the line, you make room for the new guest, but that seems absurd, because that would be like infinity plus 1, which is kind of his. And the reason that matters in this context is because if you're looking at premise 2 of the Kalam, it not necessarily can be refuted, but it's something that brings premise 2 into question, is the idea that the universe could potentially be infinite into the past. And in order to have a refutation of that, you have to somehow say infinites are absurd or impossible in order to counter it. You have to say, it needs to have a beginning the same way that it may potentially need to have an end, which is another part of the paper that we can address down the line. But it at least needs to have a beginning, which means that infinites can't be possible. And Hilbert's hotel kind of demonstrates that. But that didn't make sense to me, and you can correct where my logic might be wrong here, because it seems to me that what makes Hilbert's hotel so absurd is that because you're concurrently existing with an infinite set, you're manipulating an infinite set in real time, like at a finite point, and that's what makes it absurd. And the way that I reformulated it to understand your argument is Hilbert's hotel would be a hotel with no rooms, and an infinite amount of guests line up to come in. And each time a new guest comes in, they build a new room, and then they build a new room, and then they build a new room, and then they build a new room, and they do that infinitely. That makes more sense to me, because at any finite time, if you stop in the present moment to count the rooms, you're going to have a finite set. You're going to have a set number. However, that doesn't negate the possibility that you could lead in towards having an infinite amount of rooms, because the progression of time temporally allows for you to have the possibility of that infinite set. Whereas if you stop at any given time, you only have a finite set. And his counter seems to be that Hilbert's hotel shows you that infinities are ridiculous, therefore it can't be possible to have an infinite set back in time, even though he will allow for it forward in time. But you can't have an infinite set backward in time, because Hilbert's hotel makes infinites ridiculous, but it only makes infinites ridiculous in a very specific set of circumstances that are temporally fixed when you're counting in real time. When you do it the other way and allow for the progression of time, that ridiculousness stops making sense, because you're adding to the set that hasn't yet been completed or is on its way to completion towards infinity, as opposed to already having a completed set of infinity that you're somehow attempting to add to concurrently. Am I way off base?
No, that's right. So the idea, so there's this other distinction between an actual infinite and a potential infinite,
Right.
and that's,
Which he seems to hammer on, because he wants it to be a potential infinite, because if he says it's an actual infinite, then he has to admit that it could exist both in the past and in the future, and he needs it to only exist in the future.
Yeah. So this is Aristotle's distinction between the actual and potential infinite. So it's this classic Aristotelian way of looking at things, where he'll say, some people say the infinite exists, some people say the infinite doesn't exist. I'm in the middle between those, right? I say that the actual infinite doesn't exist, but the potential infinite does exist. Right. So he said Aristotle always cuts the middle ground between two opposing views. And this is one example of that. Now, Craig effectively endorses that, although endorses what I think is a different view of the potential infinite from Aristotle, but we don't need to go into the detail there. It's a historical footnote that I don't think he's really characterizing correctly, but nevertheless, Craig's view is that an actual infinite is, like you say, so a kind of, we could call it a completed infinite, something like that, where each and every, so imagine a hotel room where the corridors of the room, the corridors have rooms, and each room is numbered. So each one has a unique natural number. And that's true for normal hotels, of course. Each room has a unique natural number. But in this hotel, we're going to say that for every number, there's a room, which is unlike any of the actually existing hotels, of course. They only have finitely many rooms. Here, we're going to say every single natural number, there's a room for that natural number. So that means that the total number of rooms is infinite. Not that there's a room number infinity, right? But just that every single number, counting number, has a room.
Right.
Now, that's a Hilbert's hotel. So the thing about that is all of the kind of the infinitude of the rooms exists all at the same time. All today, there's all of those rooms existing currently.
Right.
So we can call that completed, and that's or an actual infinite or something.
Yeah.
Now, so you were describing, like, imagine there were no rooms today, and then we add a room tomorrow, and we add another room after that, blah, blah, blah. And then Craig's idea is, well, that is a task that could be carried on, without end. And that's a potentially infinite, right? There's never going to be infinitely many rooms in that hotel, but there's no limit to how many rooms that there'll be in there.
Isn't it the same thing, though? Isn't there no limit to the rooms that will be in there, the same as there being infinite rooms? Like, that seems like to me, to wrap my head around. If there is no limit and it could go on to infinity, isn't that the same thing as saying that infinity is possible?
So the difference is that today,
it need to be constrained somewhere in order for it to not. I don't even understand what the importance is, I guess, of the designation between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. Like, isn't the admission that a potential infinite is possible, like logically possible, the same thing as saying an actual infinite is possible? Because in order for the potential infinite to keep going,
well, we could talk about that. I mean, whether a potential infinite requires an actual infinite. Actually, I'm sympathetic to that view.
Yeah.
But I think that's quite complicated to explain that. Just to begin with, the difference between them is that in Hilbert's hotel, right, as opposed to Shannon's hotel doesn't have any rooms in, and then she starts building a room tomorrow, and another room the day after, another room the day after that, right? So in Hilbert's hotel, next door, let's say, there already is infinitely many rooms in there. Is there a room number in a million? Yes. Is there a room number 50 quadrillion? Yes. So for any n, if you ask, is there n many rooms in that hotel? The answer is yes. But that's not true for Shannon's hotel, right? One day there'll be a billion rooms in Shannon's hotel, but it's never true that for any n, that there's that many rooms in Shannon's hotel. There's always some number of rooms such that it's false that there's that many rooms in your hotel because you haven't built that far yet.
Right.
So in a million years, there'll be loads and loads of rooms, but it's still not as big as Hilbert's hotel.
Right.
So there's a kind of big difference between them, an infinitely big difference between them. Right. So that's why Hilbert's hotel is already completed. It's got every single number as a room. Your hotel is, no matter how long you keep building it for, there are numbers that you don't have corresponding in your hotel yet, although for each number you'll add it, but they're not there yet.
Right.
So the potential infinite is like sliding along a line or something where it's increasing over like time. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, it's a successive progression towards
That's right.
infinity.
But at each point it's finite. It's never actually infinite.
Right.
So a potential infinite is always finite. It
So
just has
Can
no
I interrupt
limit
for
to how
one
big it can
second
be.
to help myself understand a little bit? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to wrap my head around it.
No, do interrupt me as much as you like. It's all
Okay,
good.
you're gonna regret that. So the reason that I formulated it like that in my head is because I'm trying to relate it to the progression of time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's never going to be currently existing an infinite amount of future that I can like perceive now, that exists now. That's always going to be in the future, and or there was an infinite amount of time in the past. Like I'm only present. So the argument that this hotel has infinite rooms now doesn't seem to relate to, like in my head, this argument, because this argument is about successive progression or what has already progressed up until now.
Okay, so let's draw them together. So why are we talking about Hilbert's Hotel and the infinity of the past?
Yes.
Well, the reason is because if you were to say, let's just pick, I mean, it really doesn't matter what the interval is, but let's pick days. It could be minutes, it could be years or whatever. It could be centuries, it doesn't matter. But as long as we're picking regular intervals of time, thinking about the past, if there was no beginning to time, then there would be, say days, that we could number the past days. I could say yesterday was day 1, day before that was day 2, the day before that was day 3.
Right.
So I'm just assigning numbers to past days, right? And if I did that, I could just, at least imagining, I could just assign each day a unique natural number, just like we were doing with the knives and the forks. Right. And there'd be no natural number left over, and there'd be no days left over. And that would just show you that the mathematical word is cardinality. That just means the amount of past days must be the same as the amount of numbers, natural numbers, which is to say infinitely many. So if the past had no beginning, then the number of previous days would be like the number of rooms in Hilbert's hotel.
Okay, got you.
Right?
So adding like, 1 to, because we'd be adding 1 to an infinity, a set of infinity.
As time passes.
As time.
Yeah,
okay, I get it now. Okay, yes.
Okay,
I get it.
So that's as if like so in the Hilbert's Hotel ideas, so Craig says, imagine a guest arrives in Hilbert's Hotel, a guest arrives and says, have you got a room for me? And the manager like makes everybody shuffle up one room and makes a room for the guest, right? So kind of weird on its own that like
the hotel's extending into the past. And
well,
I'm very visual. So the hotel is extending into the past infinitely. So the absurdity comes in when you add one room to an infinite set. Whereas I was thinking of future progression. Why couldn't you just keep adding successive rooms?
Yeah. So Craig is intent on showing that the infinite past is just like Hilbert's Hotel because you can imagine each day as a hotel room.
Yeah.
And the problem with the Hilbert's Hotel is it's full, right? Each room has somebody in, but because we were talking about a moment ago, the number of even numbers is the same as the number of natural numbers. You could just make everybody shuffle into different configurations of rooms and free up as many rooms as you need to. And that's not something you can do with finite sets. If there's 10 rooms and there's 10 people in those rooms, there's not much you can do about that. Right. I mean, bunk beds or something is the best you can do. Right. But in Hilbert's Hotel, you can actually free up as many rooms as you like just by moving people around. And that's kind of, I mean, definitely it's weird. If Hilbert's Hotel existed, it would be definitely weird. And it's like the infinite past because how many days have there been? Infinitely many. Right now, we wait until tomorrow and we ask that question again, how many days have there been? well, it's infinitely many plus one, but it's actually still the same number of days, right? Still, it's not actually a greater number of days. And if you check into Hilbert's hotel, nobody checks out, then there's the same number of people as there was before, plus you. But actually, if you counted everybody, you find it's the same number of people anyway. It's just still infinitely many. And really, this is the problematic, or not problematic, but kind of strange property that the infinite has. A slice of the pie can be equal to the whole of the pie in a certain sense. So even if you add a new person to the hotel, it doesn't matter. It's still the same number of people. Even if somebody leaves the hotel, it doesn't matter. It's still the same number of people.
Yeah.
Certain operations work like that anyway.
Like the library with infinity books. If you check a book out, how many books are in the library?
That's right.
Infinity
Yeah,
books.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so Craig makes a big deal because sometimes you can say, look, imagine every person in an even numbered room checks out of the hotel. How many people are left? The same number of people, still infinitely many people. Now let's suppose everyone whose room number is greater than 3 checks out. How many people are left? Actually, only 3 people are left now. So
but how do you change a past set, though? I'm just going to interrupt you again.
Sure.
Because for those people to check out, something that has already happened would have to have not happened anymore. Like you would have to remove something from a closed timeline.
That's right. So it doesn't, I mean, I think this is right. So while it kind of makes sense to think about adding days to the past, doesn't really make sense to take days away.
Right.
You can imagine, how many days would there have been if every other day happened and not the ones in between? I mean, you kind of imagine that, especially if we're thinking about imagine I don't know, the Harry Potter universe or something. Maybe J.K. Rowling wrote it differently and every other day happened. How many days would there be? So you can kind of imagine these things. But yeah, I agree with you. In reality, there's no such thing as the possibility that yesterday doesn't happen now that it has in fact happened. Everything in the past is necessary.
Like you can't make something not have been the case.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Given the, situating a claim in today, there's certain things that are necessary, like all of the contents of the past. And they're not contingent anymore. I mean, unlike, I guess, claims about the future, where you could say something like, it's still not too late for your favorite sports team or whatever to win the championship or something. You kind of feel like those events are still open and very much up for grabs, whereas events about the past are fixed and there's nothing you can do about them now. So yeah, I agree. While there's a kind of analogy for adding guests to the hotel, that's time passing and a new day being added to the past. There isn't a direct kind of corollary for taking a day away. On the other hand, if we think about, I mean, I don't want to jump ahead, but if we think about the endless future, right, then my view is that they're very, very much the same and kind of symmetrical. So I want to say something like, how many days will there be? Well, if the future has no end, then there's infinitely many. It's just as many future days as there are guests in Hilbert's hotel. Now what happens is we wait in 24 hours and ask the question, how many days will there be? Well, should be one fewer than yesterday because today happened. So that's like a guest leaving the hotel.
So is the
right?
issue
But
that
actually it's the same number of days.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. So is the issue that we're stopping to count at a finite point in an infinite set, and that's what makes it seem absurd? Where because there's infinite past, there's also infinite future. We're hitting the pause button and going, it's absurd now because we're adding 1 to this infinite set, but really we're not even adding 1 because we're part of a continuous infinite set that goes off into infinity in the other direction. So it's not really that ridiculous when you have that perspective from both ends.
Yeah, well, I mean, so now we're talking about a kind of philosophy of time and
I'm a nightmare. I'm sorry. I don't know why.
No, I mean, these things are all closely related. That's what's so interesting about this argument. It seems to me that there's lots of philosophy of time, philosophy of maths, lots of interesting, so philosophy of religion, all these things come together in here. Philosophy of language as well, because there's this kind of distinction in philosophy of time between trying to think of the easiest way to draw this distinction. So between let's call it a dynamic view and a static view. So sometimes it's referred to as the A theory and the B theory. So So consider like the dynamic view, right? So that would say that time is like this, right? It's like the fundamental properties that that characterize time change, right? So to begin with, say for instance, me drinking this glass of wine, this being an empty glass of wine is future, right?
Okay.
But then gradually, as I keep taking sips from it, at some point, it's being empty stops being future, changes and becomes present. And then after that, it kind of slips off and stops being present or future and becomes past. So that one and the same event, the glass becoming empty, has a futureness, then it has presentness, and then it has pastness.
Okay.
So the fundamental kind of temporal concepts, pastness, presentness, and future, are like changing, and this is a dynamic kind of conveyor belt view of like events are like changing from past, from future to present to past.
Okay.
Now, on the static view, that's not the case, right? So on the static view, you'd say something like, look, the event of us having this conversation right here and the event of the wine glass being empty are related in an unchanging way, which is us having this conversation is earlier than the glass being empty, and the glass being empty is later than us having this conversation. And that earlier than, later than relation is like the relationship of like standing to the left of and standing to the right of. It's kind of symmetrical,
So there is
and it
no
doesn't like change over
present.
time.
Things
As
either
such.
were or will be, and there's no current.
Well, it's that on that static view. There's no specific kind of presentness. That's right. It's just but I think what's interesting to note about this is that both of those ways of talking about events over time are both completely natural, and we flip between them all the time. It's not like you have to pick one of these and that's your team and you hate the other team or whatever. You know, the First World War is earlier than the Second World War. That's true, right? And they're both past. I mean, like, I'm happy with both of those ways of describing that same thing. Okay. It's just that if you try and take either one of those seriously, the other one stops making any sense, right? Because if it's actually just a dynamic view, then you know, how is it that there are static, unchanging facts, right? If there's fundamental temporal, you know, properties change, they can't be changeless. On the other hand, if they're changeless, then, you know, where does the dynamic view go? So it's very, you know, very complicated and open question, really. Like, what should we think about this? Philosophers, yeah, kind of inspired by science and physics and stuff, are kind of quite happy to embrace this static view, because on kind of space-time physics or whatever, it's much more straightforward to combine things in a static view. And in relativity, it's quite hard to cash out the notion of like the present. In special relativity, you just find that there's no non-arbitrary way of cashing out which two events are simultaneous with each other, and that's very difficult to maintain that.
Who knew there was so much to consider in the Kalam? We're talking about theories.
Oh, there's tons. Yeah, absolutely tons. So let's circle back to what we were talking about a moment ago. So like, so how did this fit in? You were asking a question, I think, about like,
I was talking about infinite sets. Like, is the reason that it seems absurd because we're adding one in like this present finite moment. Like at any point in time through the succession of infinity, if you stop and count, it seems like there should be a finite set, right? Like it seems logically like there should be a finite set. But that kind of begs the question of a starting point in order for that to be the case. Like you're just assuming a starting point, as opposed to allowing the possibility, the logical possibility, that there is no starting point and it just goes back infinitely and will be going forward infinitely, because that's what infinity would mean, is that it both had an infinite past and will have an infinite future.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make... Are we back?
Yeah, it does. So I think if you take this, no, that's cool. So like, if you take this, the view that like, well, there's an infinite past behind me and an infinite future ahead of me. I think what's going on there is that you are in some way adopting the static view, right? You're imagining yourself like looking at a timeline and just going, well, look, it's all here already. It kind of all exists in some timeless sense. So what do we even mean by adding and subtracting? There really is no adding or subtracting. It's all just here already. And then if we try and, it's like a duck rabbit. And if we try and now think about it in terms of the duck instead of the rabbit, right, that it's just the present, right? And that's just changing. And there's stuff that's going to be present that's in the future, and stuff that has been present in the past, but really all that exists is present, something like that. Then you might think that allows us to draw a kind of asymmetry between them, because like well, what's the most charitable way of putting this? So Andrew Loke's version of this argument is to say something like, well, you can imagine somebody building rooms, who's been building rooms as long as time existed. And if the past, and then let's imagine the past has no beginning and the future has no end, then plausibly you still have an asymmetry, because if he's been building hotel rooms for as long as time existed and will build them for as long as time will exist, there'll be an infinite hotel only because the past is infinite. The future infinity doesn't seem to mean that there's an infinite anything right now. He could start building like Shannon's hotel, 1 room today and 2 rooms tomorrow, 3 rooms the day after, but at every point it's going to be finite. So his job will be endless, like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the mountain or whatever, but it's not at any point going to be infinite. Whereas if the past is beginningless and he's been doing this thing forever, then there'll right now be a completed Hilbert's hotel already, with each hotel room, there'll be 1 room for each natural number. And that means that, I mean, I'm trying to be plausible with this because I deeply disagree with Angie's view, but yeah, I think that's the most simple way of putting it, that there's something problematic about the infinite past that's not problematic about the infinite future, right. With respect to Hilbert's hotel.
Okay, fair enough. So we've spent a lot of time on infinities. Let's talk about why it matters so much, because it seems to me that if you just admit that time will have an end, like if you just say, regardless of whether or not it extends infinitely into the past or has a finite starting point or whatever, if you just say, okay, well, time will at some point end, there can't be an infinity, at least in the future progression, because time will just stop at some point, like it'll end, then that would negate all of this, like the last 35 minutes of discussion that we just had. So why do you think that isn't a counter that's brought up? Because it dawned on me as I was reading through, and I was like, well, why wouldn't somebody like Craig just say that, well, yeah, duh, of course, time will end. It can't be infinite. Like, the time is finite. Time will end, the end. But he doesn't. And you and Morriston seem to kind of bring forth I like the argument about the angels, because it brought me towards their conceptualization of eternal life. And because people probably don't know what I'm talking about. I'm talking to you who wrote the paper, so you probably know what I'm talking about. So like what you brought up was that there's angels, so they don't exist like in our timeline, I guess. They exist in the afterlife area where we would think that we were going if we held Craig's view. So which is I'm guessing a different type of infinity in like because you exist forever with God or whatever. I'm sure that they can argue that there's a different type of time. But if these angels were saying praises to God infinitely, at what point in time would that succession stop? And it seems as though somebody like Craig would say, well, that can't stop because that exists in a different type of scenario where they're like, and because of that, he can't say, or he just can't say that time has an end, because then he doesn't allow for an afterlife with no end. He would have to admit that was finite too. I may not be wrapping my head around that correctly. Do you want to help me?
Yeah. So I don't think that Craig needs to go quite so far as to say stuff like, it's a different type of time in the afterlife or something. So look, let's just take it back a step. So the So we were talking about the Kalam argument and premise two, which was that the universe began to exist, right?
Right.
And this Hilbert's hotel argument, which I guess I didn't actually state explicitly, is like see if I can remember off the top of my head. It goes something like um, so and it's something like an actual infinite can't be instantiated by anything that concretely exists. So that's saying you can imagine like sets and numbers and stuff that are infinite, but real things that exist like tables and glasses of wine and stuff like that, they can't be actually infinite, like Hilbert's hotel. They can be potentially infinite, but they can't be actually infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that's premise one, which is like concrete things or can't be actually infinite. And then step two is to say, if the past had no beginning, it would be a concrete instantiation of an actual infinite, right? How many days would there have been? And infinitely many, just as many as there are rooms in Hilbert's hotel, right? So if nothing concretely existing can have that property of being an actual infinite, then it follows that and if the past is an example of a thing that concretely exists, that if the beginningless past is something that concretely exists that has that property, then it follows that the past must have a beginning, right? It can't be beginningless, right? So maybe was that clear? I don't know. Maybe I was too
Maybe.
waffly.
I don't know. I think so.
So I'm saying like anything that concretely exists can't be actually infinite. If the past has no beginning, then it's actually infinite. Therefore, the past has a beginning. That's the argument.
Okay.
It can't be infinite. If it was beginningless, it would be infinite. Therefore, it has a beginning.
Okay.
Right. And what me and Morriston were doing was to say, look, okay, but let's do a kind of mirror image of that argument, right? So, and what this will do is try and establish the mirror image conclusion, which is that time must come to an end,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah.
if let's just suppose it's true that nothing concretely existing can be infinite, and now if the future has no end to it, then it's plausible that that's an example of an actually infinite concretely existing set of things, right? How many future days will there be? Just as many as there were past days if there was no beginning.
Okay.
So the two things seem completely symmetrical to us. But that must mean that the future has no end to it. However, Craig thinks that that seems to show in exactly the same way that the future must have an end to it, in exactly the same way that Craig thinks Hilbert's hotel shows that the past must have a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
However, Craig thinks that, well, when you die, you go to heaven or hell or whatever, and that is a similar type of experience as it is to be alive on Earth. It's a succession of things happening to you, your conscious experience, one thing after another. And what that means is that fundamentally you could start counting the minute you wake up in heaven and keep counting, right? And I mean, who knows what it would be like? I mean, might be like really cool and there's loads of cool stuff happening and like my pet dog is back and I'm seeing my grandma and stuff like that. But fundamentally, I could spend it counting. It's a succession of things happening.
Yeah.
But then the thought would be able to imagine somebody in the afterlife or an angel or whatever who's counting how many future praises are they going to sing? It seems like, well, imagine that angel who's starts counting now and never stops, and imagine another one who's always been counting and stops now. And we'll say about the second angel, how many numbers did they count? How many praises did they sing, or whatever? It's infinitely many, right? It's just like Hilbert's hotel. These must have counted infinite numbers or sung infinite praises. But then the guy who starts counting now in heaven, which never ends, how many numbers will he count? Infinitely many. It's got to be the same answer.
So is the argument that if it's absurd there, it has to be absurd when you're considering the Kalam also? Like you can't hold both simultaneously. Otherwise,
Yeah, that's
you
right.
either have to admit that they're both acceptable or they're both absurd.
That's right. So it's exactly. So
Okay.
if you think the Kalam shows because of Hilbert's hotel that time must have a beginning, then you should also hold that Hilbert's hotel in the Kalam shows that time must come to an end. Now, what's weird is trying to say, oh, the Kalam and Hilbert's hotel shows that time has a beginning, but it doesn't show that time has an end, which is Craig's position.
Right.
And so what we were trying to do is articulate this symmetry argument, which basically just, you've got your Hilbert's hotel argument over there, and it's sort of pointed at the past. It's all about like the past, and we've just constructed a mirror image of that, which is pointed at the future instead. And so instead of past days, it's talking about future days, blah, blah, blah. So we just changed the tense in the arguments to make this the mirror image. And then, how does Craig resist the conclusion of our new argument when he doesn't accept it, even though he accepts his version of the argument? Changing the tense shouldn't change, doesn't change whether it's a logically valid argument. Right?
So he uses saying that it's potential as what you would call a symmetry breaker in order.
Sure, yeah, one of the, yeah, exactly. So we canvassed a bunch of symmetry breakers, which are things where you're going to say, look, these two arguments are not the same. They're not symmetrical to each other. Something makes a difference between them, which shows that, one of these arguments is right and the other argument is wrong. So it's kind of symmetry breaker. And one of the kind of main one that Craig offers is to say, look, a beginningless past is an actual infinite, but an endless future is just a potential infinite. It's not an actual infinite.
Right.
And
that seems like a cop-out, though.
Yeah. I mean, and basically it's just,
could be just me. Like I said, I'm a moron before we talk. It just seems like a cop-out. It's just like saying that this could potentially, like, it hasn't happened yet, so it's only potential, whereas that has previously happened, so it's actual, is kind of what he's saying, right?
Right.
But he's also simultaneously acknowledging that there's that those angels would go on for infinity. So in that scenario, would he still say that that's just a potential?
He would, yeah. And his way of describing it would be to say it's potential infinite because at each point in time, the number of praises that the angel, so imagine the angel starts counting now, singing praises or whatever. I guess I should pick one of those two. Let's talk about singing praises.
Okay.
So the angel starts singing a praise to God once every, that's how often? Every half an hour? Give him some free
whatever.
time.
It goes on for
Not
infinity.
Every minute.
Who cares?
Well, it's a big difference between saying
could be every 300 years. It would still be infinity.
Yeah, sure. Well, that gives him a lot of free time to, catch up on Netflix.
Right. Let them have a nap.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if it's 1 second, then that's a lot more intense, even if it's the same number of praises. Anyway, let's say he sings praises once every half an hour or something, and just forever, never stops, but he starts today. Craig says, well, look, he's never going to have said infinitely many praises. He's always only ever going to be some finite way through the task, right? So tomorrow, how many praises has he said? 1. Or I guess I should stick to my units. So he would have said 48 praises by tomorrow if it's every half an hour, right? But no matter how far forwards, next week, he will have said only so many thousand praises or whatever. But it's going to be a finite number. And no matter how far forwards you consider, the number of praises he will have sung is only some finite number. And Craig says, well, there you go. So it's a potential infinite. But there's no point where he's saying, infinity many praises. Right? He doesn't say, oh, and now I finished saying infinitely many praises at some point in the future.
Well, that's because it's always impossible to stop and simultaneously reach infinity.
Right. If you begin at some point and are doing something that's discrete, like singing praises every half an hour or something,
right,
then yeah, that's right. You'll never finish. I think it's a different question. I mean, imagine the guy who's counting down numbers, and you come across him and he's saying -3, -2, -1, 0. Phew, I'm finished. And you say, what have you been up to? And he said, I've just been counting down all of the natural numbers and I've just finished, right? Now, arguably that's completing an infinite task, right?
I would say he's lying, though, because that's not possible.
Well, it's not physically possible. Yeah, that's right. But it doesn't seem logically impossible. It doesn't seem like there's a contradiction there. But I think what's going on is that they are completing an infinite task. But that's an infinite task that didn't have a beginning. It's just always been that they're counting down. Now, that's different to starting an an infinite count up, right? Where it's true there's no end to that. It can't be completed. But it's just, we have to be careful. Not every infinite sequence is can't be completed, it seems to me. Ones with a beginning can't be completed. Well, what you can't have is an infinite sequence of discrete steps that has both a beginning and an end.
Okay.
Right? If it has a beginning, then it doesn't have an end. If it has an end, like the guy counting down, then it doesn't have a beginning. And you can actually have ones that have neither a beginning nor an end, like the poor guy who's counting down through all the natural numbers and then counts up through the positive natural numbers, right? That guy, his sequence doesn't have a beginning or an end, and it's infinite. So am I confusing you too much now?
I was born confused. It's fine.
Okay,
It's fine.
cool.
It's hard to wrap your head around. I'm just trying to figure out whether or not his objection makes sense to me, and if it doesn't, why it doesn't, so that I can make sure that I'm thinking this through properly. And it seems to me that his objection is kind of arbitrary, because he's not saying it's impossible. He's just saying that at any point in time, if you stop and take account, it won't be infinity.
That's right. Yeah.
That's all he's saying. And he's presenting it as though the fact that at any point in time in the set, as you're approaching infinity, you stop and count it, the fact that it isn't currently infinity whilst you're counting, means that, like, is he trying to say that that means infinity isn't possible? It seems like he's just using the fact that at any point in time there's concurrently a finite set somehow leads towards infinity being impossible, so that he can get away from infinity being impossible in the reverse direction. And that, do you see why I think that's kind of a cop-out? Or am I not thinking about it right?
Well, I think it's right. So the way I think the clearest way to think about it is in terms of tenses, right? So if you ask the question, how many praises will the angel sing? Then I think, and consider the question about the other angel, how many praises has the angel sung, right? Because in that case, it's obvious the answer is infinitely many. Now the question over on the other side, the guy who starts singing praises now, how many praises will that angel sing? Now, I think the simple case, the symmetry idea is, well, it should be the same answer. It should be infinitely many, right? He will sing infinitely many praises. And Craig says, no, that's not right. The answer here is that at any point in time, he will have sung only finitely many praises. Now, to me, what's going on there is that he's changed the tense, which the question was in the simple future tense.
From will to will have.
Exactly, yeah. Will. So it's a simple future tense to a future perfect tense. Now, I agree that at any point in time in the future, he will have only sung finitely many praises. That's true. It's just that that's not actually an answer to the question, how many he will sing, because I think that even though he will have sung only 5 praises in 10 hours time, or 2.5 hours time, if it's every half an hour. God, I wish I'd picked a more straightforward metric. But, it's still true that he will sing infinitely many praises, because he's going to sing one every half an hour and never end. So, we just have to think about the collection of all of the praises that are future, and that's actually infinitely many, not potentially infinite. So the diagnosis that me and Wes give is that Craig changes topic by changing tense, right? To something, if you pin him down and we hold his feet to the fire, it's as plain as day. It seems to me that
it seems like a look over here to me, like, ooh, look over here.
Yeah.
Because he's saying basically, no matter at what point in the series we stop, there's a finite number. But the problem is that if you're talking about an infinite series, it doesn't stop. So inserting if we stop here changes the rules.
Yeah, it just kind of changes the focus or something. It's like it's just not relevant that it being true that you will have only sung finitely many praises just isn't relevant to the question of how many in total will you sing. It just doesn't matter.
Okay,
right?
I am understanding it then. Okay.
Yeah.
Yay, I did it!
Think about the guy counting down. I mean, maybe this is more difficult to get straight away, but
Okay.
think about the guy counting down, right? Now we've got this simple past tense question: how many praises did he sing? And the answer is obviously infinitely many. But you could also say, instead of a future perfect, you could have a past perfect, right? How many was he going to sing? So consider yesterday. How many praises? That guy? Let's keep this straight. The guy. Let's say he's counting down, right? One number a day. So 10 days ago, how many numbers was he going to count? 10 numbers. He still had 10 numbers left at that point, right? So the answer is 10. What about the day before? Well, the answer is he was going to count 11 numbers, right? What about the day before? It's 12, whatever. Any day we pick going back, there's a finite number of numbers that he was going to, that he still had left to count through, right? That's true, but it doesn't change it in the slightest bit. The answer to how many numbers did he count in total? Now that's infinitely many, right? It doesn't make any difference that at any point in the past you pick, he only had finitely many to go. That's not like, that doesn't like change, it doesn't affect the fact that he still counted his way through infinitely many numbers. And all we're doing with this future version of it is the same thing, right? How many numbers will he count? Infinitely many. How many will he have counted by tomorrow? Oh, finitely many. Like those two things are just true at the same time, so they don't impede each other. Anyway, sorry.
Sorry, I want to ask a question for clarification, because the reason it doesn't, that is difficult for me to wrap my head around, because if you're saying he started with infinity numbers and at some point in time can end at zero, that's hard for me to wrap my head around.
With infinity. Never started, right?
Okay.
Just always has been counting down. No matter what time you pick, he's always been counting before that already.
Got you. Okay, so it just goes back, like, no matter what time you pick in the series, you can always go back further, and he was counting more numbers. And then you can go back further, and he was counting more numbers.
And at each point in the past, how many numbers has he counted? He's already counted infinitely many numbers, right?
Got you.
Because
because he counted all the infinity before he hit 20, and he counted all the infinity before he hit 30, and so on and so on.
Exactly. So at each point, he's got finitely many left, but he's already done infinitely many. And now the counting up guy, it's exactly the opposite way around, right? How many has he done? Oh, finitely many. How many has he got left? Infinitely many. So the two things are completely symmetrical with each other. As long as you get your tenses straight, you don't get confused by it. And it seems to me that Craig just has a blind spot here, it seems to me. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, Craig, he's a liar, he's a blah, 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 whatever. I don't
He called my boyfriend a brain dead idiot, so.
It's up to him. But I mean, I don't know if Craig's, I don't think Craig's like straightforwardly a liar or something, but I do think he's got a blind spot here. And I mean, I was lucky enough to have a conversation with him about this. And I put exactly to him in these terms. And he just didn't seem to understand or something. Like it was very strange, because it seems to me it's as completely plain as day, clear as anything could be. And that somehow Craig doesn't understand is kind of weird. But my way of thinking about it is he's been thinking about this in the kind of, there's a duck and a rabbit here. And he's been like a duck guy for 40 years, like publicly defending, like it's a duck, not a rabbit. And it's just very difficult for him to actually slip into the rabbit view of it, because he's a duck guy. That's how I rationalize his not understanding my plain as day explanation.
Yeah, so it's a form of
it could be that I'm wrong, of course, and I don't understand, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, so it's a form of dissonance where he's kind of married to it, and the objections aren't necessarily ringing through to him and being perceived the same way that you're perceiving them, and perhaps that could go vice versa as well, I suppose.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I obviously I also suffer from, and I think everybody does, with not understanding things that are plain as day. That I mean, we very briefly talked. Yeah, exactly. We talked just very briefly earlier about chess, and I mean, I play chess all the time, and every day I play chess, and I make really dumb moves, and as soon as I do it, I'm like, oh, why didn't I see that? Like, it's so obvious or something. In the moment, I just didn't see it, right? I know the rules. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I just made a mistake. I just messed up. And it's something like that. I just think it's just possible to get yourself into a cul-de-sac where you can't see out the other side of it anymore. Right. But for me, I think Wes and I got to the point where we just see clearly this little bit of the argument. And it's not like I'm saying everybody believes Craig, and then we've come along and changed everything or whatever. It's not like that. I mean, there's a ton of dissenting voices from Craig's defense of the Kalam, of course. People who accept it as well, but
Yeah.
and there's lots of disagreement on the Hilbert's Hotel stuff. In particular, it's kind of the least persuasive, I think, widely accepted amongst philosophers. So, people just don't think that that his argument here is very persuasive. And what we're trying to do is really bring out what's going on here and how. Well, actually, I mean, one way of looking at this is to say I'm not really objecting to Hilbert's Hotel, because what we're doing is accepting, just for the sake of the argument, that there can't be any concretely existing infinite collections of things, just for the sake of the argument, and saying, well, if that's true, you should hold that the future has an end to it, but you don't. So what's going on there?
Yeah.
And
that's what I got from your paper, is that, like,
yeah.
It's like, why won't you just admit that the future has an end?
Exactly. Or admit that it doesn't show you.
Wouldn't it feel better if you just said, hey, maybe the future has an end? Like, why won't you fucking do that?
Yeah, that's right. So in some sense, then, it's a kind of it's an ad hominem argument, not because we're calling him a loser or something, but because we're saying you have a collection of beliefs that are kind of inconsistent. Like, something has to give here, because how can you think this argument shows this thing when the other argument that's the same doesn't, shows that
you're
the future
saying this here
and
this here, and it seems like you can't hold both simultaneously.
So
it does relate to him, because he's espousing both, and you're just pointing out an inconsistency within the two where they may contradict each other. So it's kind of an ad hominem in that regard, but you're not saying, hey, you're an idiot, so nobody should believe you, which is the way that people perceive ad hom.
Yeah, so ad hominem has generally two sort of meanings, and one of them is to say, this argument's wrong because the guy making it's an idiot, and the other one is to say, your beliefs are inconsistent. What are you going to do about that?
Yeah.
So we're making an argument. Well, broadly speaking, in the second, I think Wes is less inclined to see it like that. He thinks it's independently plausible that the future could be endless, and that. The fact that the future version of Hilbert's Hotel argument seems to show that the future must come to an end is itself a reason to think that the future version of the Hilbert's Hotel argument must be wrong, and because there's no difference between that, and there's no relevant difference between that and the actual Hilbert's Hotel argument, it shows you that one's wrong too. So they both stand or fall together, and he thinks that it's plausible that the future could just be endless, in which case Hilbert's Hotel argument must be jumped.
But it's not conceivable that the past could be simultaneously. Okay, I think I got it.
Yeah, they have to be the same, basically.
We have questions, and I think we've kind of organically come to a stop, and I don't want to hold you too much longer, because I know I told you I said that there would be a finite amount of time that we were going to do this for. So I want to read the questions off. Oh, I've already lost my first super chat. Somebody sent me a super chat quite some time ago. It was John Buck, and I wanted to read it, and it's gone, and I'm devastated that YouTube didn't aggregate it for me. John, if you're still watching, can you please tag me in the chat with your question so that I can make sure that I read it? If you're still watching, I'm very sorry, but YouTube didn't aggregate it, or if somebody can let them know. This one's from Paulogia. How many thoughts has God already had? An infinite number of thoughts? If so, that's an actualized infinite past. If not, can the universe appeal to the same escape?
Yeah, so this is a conversion of a class of arguments is sometimes referred to as a kind of infinite God objection, right? Which is to say something like, okay, let's suppose Hilbert's Hotel couldn't exist. Mm-hmm. Well, God has that Hilbert's Hotel property too, for whatever reason. So Paulogia gives a version of it there. How many thoughts has God had? Another way of thinking about it would be, how many beliefs does God have, right? Because presumably God knows all true things, and arguably there's infinitely many true things because there's infinitely many mathematical truths. For instance, 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 2 = 3, blah, blah, blah. So you can construct easily infinitely many sets. So God must believe all of those things that are true, in which case God has infinitely many beliefs, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not a big fan of these types of arguments, just because, I mean, it's just so easy to say, well, yeah, but God doesn't have beliefs in that way, and just make up some way that God has beliefs that's different to that. So Craig actually does something similar, where he appeals to another way. In fact, Thomas Aquinas has this idea that God's knowledge is kind of a one undifferentiated kind of idea or something. It's not like our knowledge, which is sort of propositional and broken up into little bits. He just knows everything all as one whole. So how many things does God know? Kind of one big infinite idea, and it's not broken up like ours is. And the problem is to assume that God's knowledge is like ours. So I'm not a big fan of that type of argument. I don't think it's as gotcha. It's as good a gotcha as you think, unless you can get your a Christian opponent to say, yeah, God knows individual little snippets of information like we do. If they make that move, then it's, then these arguments are better. But unless they've made that concession, which is a bit strange, I don't think these arguments are so great.
So,
sorry, you were going to say something.
No, it's totally fine. I had a thought mid you talking, because I study psychology, right? So when people sort of anthropomorphize God in bits and pieces, it seems weird to me, because they seem to be ascribing him these cognitive properties and these emotional properties while simultaneously divorcing him from those properties when it's convenient. And I find it difficult to feel as though he has all of this knowledge simultaneously while also desiring relationships with us, like having these emotional states that we can affect. Because if we can affect these emotional states, like if he can be disappointed in us or happy with us or want things for us, that seems like it would be something that isn't this one thing that he knows. It's more fluid, but I may be thinking about it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of difficulty reconciling the kind of God of the philosophers, which is an unchanging, atemporal, disembodied, powerful agent or whatever, with the God of the Bible, which is like very much kind of emotional dude who like walks around and throws things at people and stuff.
But
And
like, why would he want to create though, too? Like, if he's entirely self-sufficient, what motivates him to do something like create a universe and all those tiny little stupid people so that he can have a relationship with us?
Yeah, I don't know. It's very strange.
Okay. Anyway, so I want to get John's question in, because he did send a super chat and it disappeared. John's a theist. I'm very glad you're here, John. My question was: some people use a modified causal premise in place of the one in the Kalam to say anything that begins to exist has a material cause. ... And I guess that would follow with like, what do we think of that? You had a limit here, so.
Okay, so I think the idea is supposed to be, so we didn't really talk about this first premise, which is
we kind of bypassed it entirely. Right?
Yeah. And yeah, I'm really into the second premise philosophical arguments rather than the first premise stuff. So I'm into the infinity, beginningless time stuff. The causal stuff's not so much interesting to me, but one sort of what the question is getting at is, look, so why think that everything that begins to exist has a cause? Well, one reason for thinking that is because, like, this thing that began to exist, well, it has a cause. Like this thing that began to exist, this had a cause. Yeah, I began to exist, I had a cause. In fact, everything we can catalog that began to exist had a cause, right? So that's like kind of empirical data gathering. We find this is a trend, this is a big pattern. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Seems reasonable because everything that we've experienced that began to exist has a cause, right? So that's kind of like a decent empirical generalization to make or something. However, the move here, which I think was it John you said was getting at?
Yes, John Buck. Yeah.
John. Okay, cool. Yeah. Is that that actually the generalization you could say is, look, this thing that began to exist, well, its cause was that it was made out of pre-existing material, right? That's also true for me as well. It's also true for this wine glass. In fact, actually find anything that began to exist that wasn't made out of pre-existing material. You can't do that. Like that, every example of everything that we found that began to exist, that's just pre-existing stuff rearranged into a new shape or whatever. And that's what we mean by this thing beginning to exist. So when it comes to the beginning of the universe, if we're supposed to imagine that it was made out of nothing, right? That God just like makes it makes it exist, and it's not making out of like his own elbow or something. It's like nothing existed, and then he made that thing exist out of nothing. Well, that's not like any of the other previous examples of causation that we've got. So we can't support it in the same way, right? We don't have an inductive base of examples that support that generalization. It would be the only thing that began to exist without a material cause.
So it doesn't follow the same logic, because everything else is just a reconfiguration of existing material, and we're saying that the reason everything has a cause is because it's a reconfiguration of existing material that we've witnessed. And in this instance, it would be something completely different from that scenario. It would be making all existent material. So the same doesn't apply. Is that
so? I mean, I'm not saying that didn't happen, but I'm just saying you can't point at all of the humdrum examples of things around us as being relevantly similar, because they're relevantly dissimilar, right? They all they all are just pre-existing stuff made into a different shape. But what we're talking about here is existence out of nothing. We don't have any examples of that. So what's the reason for thinking that happened? Like, you can't just support it by pointing at like wine glasses and tables and stuff, because those things are pre-existing material pushed into a different shape. Whereas the universe existing out of nothing is some other type of thing. And well, what's the evidence that we've got that that's even possible?
See, he had a further extension to the question that I'm sorry I missed, but I just want to get it in while I have the opportunity, then I'll go to the next super chat. So the further part to his question was, but wouldn't this still affirm the original premise, because a material cause is still a type of cause?
I guess it affirms the idea that it affirms, let's see, so if the original premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause, and you look around, well, we don't find things that begin to exist with no cause whatsoever. That's true. So in that sense, the evidence that we're gathering here is relevant. It does seem to support that. I mean, I don't have any examples of things beginning to exist without a cause, like to bolster the claim, if you like, that things begin to exist without a cause. It's not a claim I make, right? I don't really need to make that claim.
I've seen people argue about quantum things popping into exist, but
yeah, right.
That's way out of my league. But I just think it pushes things into the realm of plausibility when you go down to a quantum level. And
I mean, look, if we're going to push on the door of like fundamental physics, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that like the notions of like material cause, efficient cause, blah blah blah, they're not items of contemporary physical discourse about stuff, right? We don't find in quantum mechanics any things called causes and any things called effects. It's not, so for that reason, it's not really fair to say, oh, quantum mechanics gives us examples of effects without causes. That's just not part of the vocabulary whatsoever.
But we don't have an example like that with the beginning of the universe either. It's all just, speculation, right?
Yeah, but when you really look at what's going on with those physical theories, they're mathematical in nature. And the way we're talking about this is with these kind of pre-existing philosophical concepts. And I guess all I'm trying to say really is that they don't really fit very well. Our philosophical concepts just don't really describe what physicists are talking about very well at all. And if you want to talk like the physicists, you have to do the mathematics. And if you're not going to do that, then you're not going to be able to describe properly what's going on there. And one of the main takeaways is that they don't have a straightforward notions of cause that we take ourselves to have from everyday discourse. Like, this wine glass exists because I made it or whatever. Like, that stuff is just not how, it doesn't make any sense in the fundamental physics stuff, right? If you really want to talk about quantum mechanics, you have to be rigorous about it.
But aren't we doing that with talking about like the beginning of universes? Isn't that just like a greater scale of the same sort of thing? Like, wouldn't the argument that you just made about addressing quantum things popping in and out of existence without like a cause, wouldn't that translate to this as well?
The way I think about it is that we're participating in a type of game, right, which is the Kalam cosmological argument game,
right?
And that takes for granted a whole bunch of stuff, and basically takes for granted that we're not talking in the language of, say, quantum mechanics when we do it.
But why can't we do that there too?
Well, and so this is what I'm saying is that if you actually want to say let's just do this all in mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, then it just doesn't get off the ground because like there's nothing about causation as such in there, right? We'd have to just I just don't think you could even make the argument in that case.
But when
So
you
what
get
we're
to
doing is
universes beginning, couldn't it potentially be something that is related to quantum mechanics?
yeah, I guess so. But well, when we're talking about like everything that begins to exist has a cause,
Yeah.
I just don't know what that means in the language of quantum mechanics. I don't know until someone can explain that to me properly. I just I don't think that it makes any
Yeah,
sense.
and
And
like I
actually, it
said, I'm an
was.
idiot, so like it just seems like it would be analogous to me because if we're starting with something infinitely small that just pops into existence, that's something that we see kind of demonstratively, I guess, happen in quantum mechanics. So it seems like it could factor into this even, and potentially be analogous when we're talking about, you know, the beginning of things and the universe being a thing. Then maybe that's something that factors.
Well, I think to explain my point properly would take rather a long time, but the formalism of quantum mechanics has like vectors in Hilbert space, which is like
Oh,
an infinite dimensional. Yeah.
you're right
Um,
past me
so,
now.
so I guess like
I'm just being
in
antagonistic for fun.
in classical physics, you've got this idea of like points in space time,
Hmm.
so coordinates, like three spatial points and one temporal point, picks out a kind of point event. And quantum mechanics just doesn't have that, right? It talks about states in Hilbert space and that they're vectors. It's completely different. So it's a radical divergence of um, it's not we're not talking about anything that can be easily mapped from one thing to the other. So when we're doing this philosophy stuff about the Kalam, we're just taking for granted all of these old school philosophical concepts and just playing with that to see what it tells us.
Okay.
Right? I'm quite happy that that's what we're doing. It's not a real physically realistic description of the universe because I mean our best physically realistic description of the universe is in alien concepts that mean they're very difficult to give even the most basic um, connections to these philosophical ideas about causation. So yeah, I think there's a big gulf between what physics is talking about these days and what the terms that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. They're very different from each other. I think that actually that fact is relatively poorly understood by people um, who think they know stuff about quantum mechanics and physics and stuff. They don't really get
I
how,
admittedly know
how
nothing,
alien
really.
it is. Anyway, let's continue because
Yes, okay,
I might
there's
be
one more
flogging a dead
question.
horse now. Okay.
So can't you run the clock backwards so the angel counting into the future has counted infinity times? What do you think Craig would say about that? So, like, you essentially make that angel Hilbert's hotel.
One who's counting into the future.
No, it like you, the angel, can you not make the angel so that the angel exists now but has already said infinite praises, but now it's now? And they're
Mhm.
continuing on towards infinity, but you're adding one each half hour interval to keep with your metric. And but that angel has already said infinite praises. Can you not use that as essentially an opportunity to refute his Hilbert Hotel argument by utilizing the angel? Is the way I understood that person's question.
Yeah, that sounds to me what we were doing in the paper is trying to see the symmetry or not between the angel who's sung praises forever in the
Mm-hmm.
past and the one who will sing praises forever in the future. And you could think about that as one and the same guy and then like rewinding, if you like. I guess the analogy of rewinding is more confusing than helpful to me. I don't really know what it means to rewind time, right? I mean, even if I filmed him and then watched the tape in reverse, I'm still watching it with time moving in the future. So I'm not actually reversing or rewinding anything. So um, I think plausibly interpreting what he's saying, it's basically what we've been talking about already. I think it's just easier to not bring in the analogy of rewinding and just think about the past and the future, because at least that's
Yeah.
somewhat clear.
I think what he was really trying to do was just demonstrate that if you like substituted the angel for Hilbert's Hotel, It would basically be like you wouldn't have to have this juxtaposition between the angel in this scenario and Hilbert's hotel in this scenario. The angel could exist
Oh
in
yeah,
both
right.
scenarios, except for instead of hotel rooms adding, it would be praises in that
Yeah, yeah. So
instance.
that's right. That's exactly right. So the idea is that the angel singing praises um, is exactly analogous to Hilbert's Hotel.
Yeah, it's a
That
more perceptually clear symmetry for somebody like perceiving the argument to rather than them being disanalogous with one another because one's a like hotel and the other is an angel. If you make them both the angel, then there's this very precise perceptual symmetry between the two of them.
sure. Okay,
Yeah,
good. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's the way I understood the question. And the last one is just $20 from Quiet Gorilla for my asshole cat. Thank you very much. She is still an asshole. Thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. I'm sure you didn't, but I don't care because I did. So it doesn't matter what you think.
Cool.
Thank you so
No,
much.
it's very fun. I always enjoy talking about this. So
Oh, I'm so excited that I finally got a chance to speak to you directly. We've been talking for what seems like forever now because both of our schedules are a nightmare and you're all the way across the ocean. So thank you for making the time. I'm going to throw up my end screen now so people can't see us but can still hear us. And I will say, please go check out Alex. He won't promote himself, but I'm going to put the link to his channel down below as well as the paper. I'm going to promote him because he won't promote himself. And as always, everyone, help elevate the discourse.